So as a next step, I want to allow the user of this web app to actually add his or her own learning resources. So for that, we need a form where users can enter a title, a description, and a link. And I actually want to give the user two buttons, which can be used to switch between this view here, where we see the list of learning resources, and that form, which we still have to create. So therefore, I will start by adding a new component in learning resources, and that's the addResource.view file, which is the component where eventually new resources can be added. And for the moment in the template, I'll just add a h2 tag where I simply want to say add resource so that we can identify this component when it's on the screen. Because I actually want to start working on another component first. And that's the resources.view component. I chose this naming because we'll only use that once in the entire application, and it will be a main entry point of our resources area here. And the idea of the resources component is that in there we in the end have tabs, you could say. We got two buttons that allow us to switch between stored resources and add resource. So therefore in the resources, I'm of course also adding a template. And in that template, I now want to have these two buttons. I'll actually wrap them in the base card component because I want to have that card look around the buttons. And then in there, we can add a base button. We'll add two base buttons to be precise, so I'll copy that. And the first button says stored resources. So this button takes us to the stored resources component. The second button says add resource because that, you guessed it, will take us to the add resources component. And how could we implement this now? How could we implement this tabs feature? We can actually use the dynamic component feature you learned about in the last course module. So for that, in the script part here, I will add my data property to store some data that belongs to this component only. And here I want to manage the currently selected tab. Of course, that name here is up to you. And I'll start with the stored-resources tab, but this can also be changed to add resource, and then I'll use that to later switch between the two components. So now I also want a method, of course, which allows me to change the selected tab. So let's add this method's option to this configuration object. And here I'll add a setSelectedTab method, where I get the tab that should be selected as an argument. And then we can set this selected tab equal to tab. Now, where should this method be called? That would be our buttons. So here on the first button, upon a click, I want to call this method. So I will point at setSelectedTab and tell View how to execute it. Here, View should then execute it with an argument of stored resources. And here for add resource, I'll also add a click and set selected tab to add resource. And now let's take a quick pause here at this point, because I'm doing something here which we actually haven't done before. And do you see what that is? It has nothing to do with dynamic components. I'm adding a click listener on base button. Well, on the one hand, this might not be too fancy. We added click listeners to buttons throughout the entire course. But keep in mind, this is no regular button. This is our own custom component. Why can I add a click listener on it? I mean, click, after all, is not a custom event I'm emitting in there. If we have a look at the base button, this component doesn't emit any event. And here on this button, on the native HTML button, there is no click listener. This is actually a special behavior Vue has. When you add props or event listeners on custom components, then by default, they fall through to the root level element in that custom components template. So if I add any props or event listeners to base button, for example, they will fall through and will be applied to the root HTML element in base buttons template, which in this case is the native HTML button. So this click listener here falls through to this native button here in this template. So it's automatically added to this button, you could say. That's happening behind the scenes. And that's an important behavior of Vue.js which I'm utilizing here, which we haven't seen before because we didn't really have a great place for using that. But here it's absolutely something that helps us for wrapping this button. So with that, we can add this click listener here and change the selected tab upon clicks on those buttons. Now, of course, I don't just want to change that data here, I also want to reflect the change in the user interface. To be precise, I want to render either the stored resources or the add resource component. And therefore, below my base card here, I'll now add the built-in component, which is that component you use for dynamic components, as you learned. And here we bind the isProp to tell Vue which actual component should be rendered here. So we need to pass the HTML element tag of our custom component. Now that's why I'm using my tags here as selected tabs, stored resources, and add resource. That will be my custom component HTML tags. And therefore here we can point at selected tab. Of course, this will now only work if we register my own components here though. Because currently add resource is registered nowhere and stored resources is registered in the app.vue file. Now if we register it there, it's really only available there in the template. It's not available anywhere else. So to ensure that stored resources can be used here in the resources, I'll remove it from here because we'll not need it here anymore. If we would, we could register it there as well. You can register a component locally in multiple components, but we won't need it here. Instead, I now go to the resources, import stored resources here, though I need to adjust the import path because actually the stored resources.vue file is now in the same folder as the resources.vue. And then here in components, I want to register stored resources. And the same, of course, for the newly added add resource component. Import it from addResource.vue and then register it here as a local component. Now we'll be able to render both, but we'll have a couple of problems. Now for one, in app view, I no longer can use this stored resources component. So we should remove it there from the template. But in addition, stored resources also wants a prop. It wants this resources prop, which I use for looping through all the resources. And now that we're using a dynamic component here, I'm no longer passing that prop. So how can we work around that next?